What I want to talk to you about now is how we can fine tune this to make this even more versatile. Think about what we've done. We've squared up the rip fence to the cutting guide. There's no guarantee that this is actually square to the holes here on the MFT table. Now this is a precision table and all these holes are perfectly aligned. So wouldn't it be useful if this rail was not only square to the rip fence, but it's also square to these guides here? So if I wanted to bring a piece of material in, and I wanted to take a couple of dogs and reference the material off those dogs and cut it, that cut was also guaranteed to be 90 degrees. If I wanted to reference a piece of material at an angle across there and cut it, that cut will be dead on 45 degrees. So if we tuned this table by making this rail here 90 degrees exactly to the layout of the holes, that gives me a little bit more flexibility. So I won't always have to rely on the protractor. So let's look at doing that. To fine tune the table, I'm going to take my cutting area and I'm going to come down and reference it in the hole. And I'm going to make sure it's fitting flat on the bench but is still secured by the clamps. I'm going to take some dogs, the Festool ones, and I'm going to drop those into some holes to give me a 90-degree angle between those faces. And then I'm going to take my angle finder, referencing against here, I'm going to push it against those dogs so they all rotate round and give me my angle. Now, strangely, that on this table has come out at exactly 90 degrees. I'm not overly surprised because obviously Festool have factory fitted this, but let's assume that it's not, and let's look how we're going to fine tune it, because over time this is going to drift anyway. It all comes down to this little clamp here that we were looking at earlier on. That's actually a 4mm, so the 5mm that comes with the kit doesn't fit, so we need to use a 4mm key. And what we would do, we would just loosen this off and slide it out of the way. Then taking your 5mm Allen key or hex wrench, just loosen off those two bolts that we put in place earlier on. Loosen the top one, down, loosen the bottom one. And that just gives me a bit of movement here at the back. Then come back in with my angle finder, reference it against those Festool faces, and now I just want to adjust this fence. This end needs to come down a bit, so just loosen off the knob and just I'm just going to adjust this fence now until it reads exactly 90 degrees. 89.3, nearly there, 89.6. Now that is now bang on 90 degrees. So I now know that this reference edge here is exactly 90 degrees to these three dogs. So any piece of material I reference against any of the holes will now have a cut at 90 degrees, and that gives me more versatility. So with that done, come back over to this end and just tighten down these bolts. Lift the rail up and just loosely tighten the inside one. This one's not got to be super tight on the inside. And now that should still fall down, and referencing your hole at the front, and a final check, 90 degrees perfectly. Take your stop and slide the stop back up, push it hard against the bracket, nip that up, and then tighten it. Good job. With that done, this now gives me more flexibility. So I can put dogs pretty much anywhere in this table. I can reference a piece of wood against those dogs, and that is always going to give me a 90-degree cut. Similarly, if I take these dogs and I reference them through the diagonal and put in my piece of wood, that will then give me a perfect 45 degrees. So without now messing around with the protractor, in fact the protractor is not even fitted, I can now get perfect repeatable cuts every single time. Gives me more flexibility, and I still can use a protractor if I wish. What I can also do here is I can still use this fence. So if I still want to be able to make repeatable cuts using a rip fence, I can lift my guide rail up. Now I can reference this against the dogs here. Slide that up to, it's just over that halfway hole, and now I can still use this clamp to come along, lock that hard against the back dog, take another clamp, reference this one hard against the front dog, and lock that into position. And now I've still got my rip guide as well, locked in to 90 degrees. Now with everything squared off, everything set up, ready to go, the next thing or the final thing you need to do is just to initiate the table. And what that means is we're going to cut a small groove through the MFT top of 5 millimeters deep. We're also going to trim down the splinter guard on the rail so it matches the TS55 plunge saw that I have. The reason we want to put the groove in the top is that supports the material that we're cutting, in effect creating a second splinter guard underneath. That means that when we're cutting our final material, not only is everything going to be 90 degrees or 45 because we've made this thing really precise now, there's also going to be no tear outs and no splinters on the final cut. That's great because I can take from this table to my final carpentry, and that's a huge saver in time. So let's do the final cut through this. Get my TS55 set up, we'll come back in and look at that. I now need to calibrate the TS55 to the track. First thing I want to do is to make sure that it's sitting square and parallel on the track. And when you first get this, you can see you put it onto the track, which is simply this line here interlocking with this groove, this channel here. It slides on there, and you can see there's quite a lot of play on that saw. If you leave that in on your cut, you're not going to get perfect cuts, as this thing will be moving on you as you're cutting. On the side of the TS55, there's two green cams, one at the front and one at the back. What they basically are is eccentric cams, so they're not circular, and as you turn that round you can see that the camber on the cam is pushing against this black foot here, and that simply tightens the saw onto the track. What you need to be able to do is to make sure that you take all the wobble out of the saw, but you don't make it too stiff that you can no longer push it. So starting with one end first of all, start with the one nearest to you, just keep tightening that up till that part of the saw is no longer whittling, and then make sure that's fine. Then do the same with the front. Just turn the cam, there, that's gone. And just as that goes, it should still be able to slide freely, and that's exactly what you're looking for. With the TS55 now firmly set on the track and tuned into the track, I want to cut my 5mm line across the MFT table for that chip breaker. On my TS55 I have two scales. I have an FS scale, which is I'm using it on the FS track, and I have one with no markings, which is the depth of cut if I'm using it just on a flat surface. So I put it onto the track, I use the FS scale, and I set the FS scale to 5mm. Now when I plunge my saw down, it hits the stop, that's exactly at 5mm into this table. So in theory I can slide this all the way back here now onto the rail, plunge down, cut through, and that will not only give me the 5mm here, but it will trim down this chip guard as well. Safety gear on. Connect the vacuum hose. Connect the power lead. Midpoint speed about 4 on the TS55 and plug it into the CTL26. And that's it. I now have my line cut through my MFT table at a depth of 5mm. I have trimmed down the edge here, the chip guide on this piece of wood, and everything is beautifully square. Thanks for watching. See you next time.